I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Patrick Hartley. He is the Complete Streets Program Coordinator with the City of Tucson, and he's worked with the city since 2019. In addition to overseeing the Complete Streets Program, he's the co-project manager for the Move Tucson process, which is the big city process, transportation, sort of updating the city's transportation plans and doing it in a way that benefits all of the roadway users and pedestrians and so on. So it's a pretty big deal. There's been a lot of stakeholder outreach, and Patrick's going to fill us in more on that project. Prior to coming to the city, Patrick spent 6 years at Pima Association of Governments, where he worked in the areas of modal and long-range planning. He was also a planner at Imagine Greater Tucson. And finally, he received his master's degree in urban planning from the University of Arizona. So I'm going to turn things over to Patrick to get us started.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me to give a presentation on the not so recently, but fairly recently completed Move Tucson process, which is, Kevin mentioned, was the city's recently wrapped up transportation master plan. So I will start sharing the presentation. So I got a 20 to 30 minute presentation, and then we'll have time for any questions. Let me bring that up. Great. So as I mentioned, we're talking today about Move Tucson, which was about a 2-year planning effort, really looking at an opportunity to rethink how we are prioritizing investments in the city's transportation system. That's me. Again, I was the co-project manager on this effort. If you have any questions about Move Tucson that you want to get a hold of me on, or anything related to Complete Streets, there's my contact information. I'm sure you can also share it after the meeting with the attendees, but anybody's welcome to reach out if you have any follow-up questions. So getting into kind of the meat of the topic today, Move Tucson, as we ended up calling it, was the city's 20-year master transportation plan. And the ultimate goal of this effort was kind of, with the timing, thinking about how can we develop a prioritized list of projects and programs, really thinking about what the city's needs are. We wanted to kind of start this in 2019, 2020, really to align us with the efforts of the RTA next planning process. So RTA 1, if you're familiar with that, is kind of coming to a conclusion. It's been a 20-year, up to now, about 16-year half-cent sales tax for the purposes primarily of transportation improvements. Lots of road widenings are kind of the essence of that planning effort. And we're kind of coming to the end of that phase of investments in the city's transportation system. So it really made sense for us to revisit our priorities, our long-term investment strategies, and establishing a vision for what we think we want to do with the city's transportation system, and what that next package and what that next cycle of investments is going to look like in our system. And this is really, to my knowledge, the first really multimodal long-range transportation plan that the city has done for itself. Typically, we've worked with the MPO, Pima Association of Governments, who also oversees Regional Transportation Authority. And if I start going down a rabbit hole of jargon and acronyms, feel free to stop me if you have any clarifying questions about what any of those entities are, any of the background on that. I'm happy to answer it as well. There's with all government, an alphabet soup of different transportation entities with slightly different purviews. So anyway, so the MPO manages kind of Pima County-wide, regional-wide transportation investments. And, you know, we've got 9 entities within that might have slightly different priorities. So we really wanted to focus on what were the city's needs within that context, within the region, and really hear from the residents and look at our data. So I'm sure, as many of you are very well aware, Tucson really grew up around kind of an arterial network. We have our super grid of streets, larger kind of crosstown roadways, 4 to 6 lanes, kind of medium speed, a lot of the signalized network. And this is just granted kind of a bad example, an intentionally bad example of, a typical arterial in Tucson. You see there's no bike lane, there's no sidewalks. We've got 6 lanes here. So this is really an auto-dominated environment, which is pretty typical, I think, of a lot of the city. And we wanted to kind of take this opportunity to think about, is that still the right approach for this community, particularly after really focusing on, I would say, kind of automobile capacity with the RTA plan. And that was a big emphasis of that effort. And now we wanted to revisit that and see again if that is the right approach for the city within our regional body. So in 2019, the City of Tucson approved the Complete Streets policy. Are you guys all familiar with the concept of complete streets? I see a yes and a no. I will defer to the no. So the complete streets is basically just a philosophy of transportation planning in which you make your decisions to meet the needs of all users. So you aren't simply just kind of making decisions based on congestion, adding roadway capacity, kind of prioritizing automobiles, which has been kind of the longstanding practice in transportation planning and engineering. So there's been a movement since probably the mid-90s, early 2000s, and it's a national effort looking at complete streets, which is really rebalancing our investments and our priorities in transportations, making sure that the default is to always invest in pedestrian facilities, bikeways, comfortable transit experiences, pickups, drop-offs, freight, and kind of finding that right mix, but understanding and recognizing that it's not going to be the same on every roadway. So a big, 6-lane arterial that moves traffic is still going to need to accommodate pedestrians safely and as comfortably as possibly, but it also is going to have a different role within our network than something that's more of a downtown street. But it's really, I think, centering and emphasizing the importance of alternative modes or more active modes of transportation within transportation, because that, when we talk about rebalancing, that's where we have to rebalance too. It's not continuing to make kind of equally balanced investments. It's rebalancing the entire network, providing additional transportation choices by emphasizing, I think, those modes. So I want to say there's about 11 or 1,200 communities across the country that have now adopted complete streets policies in some form. With the latest transportation bill that came out a couple months back, the federal government is now emphasizing a complete streets approach, and they've built that into the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, which we're now being funded under from the federal level. So there's a lot of momentum in this direction. And Tucson is really benefiting from being a little bit ahead of the curve, at least in terms of how we've taken this and began to adopt it. So it was under that thinking and that policy framework that was approved by mayor and council that we went into the Move Tucson process. So kind of the complete streets policy lays out the philosophy of the types of investments we want to be making in the city, which is improving safety, providing transportation choices, making sure that we're really framing decisions around a lens of equity, that we're kind of rebalancing and making sure that we're investing in the areas where the needs are highest, where there's traditionally been lower levels of investment. So we built this long-range plan around that, thinking, okay, now we've got the philosophy for investment, but where do we specifically want to put our dollars, prioritize spending? What policy changes do we want to make in the city on the long term over that 20-year horizon? So we came up with a 4-phase process, which kicked off in the winter of 2019. I want to say we had our first meeting in October, and we started with kind of visioning an inventory of the system, where we are today. And then we took that and moved into a big public engagement effort, which I'll talk quite a bit about this morning. Took all that information, turned it into a set of recommendations, guiding principles, projects, and now we're moving in and have started the implementation phase of the Move Tucson effort. So to break that down a little bit, we started out with the community priorities and the existing conditions. And the community priorities, we're hearing from residents of Tucson, basically, what do you want out of your transportation system? We then married that to the existing conditions analysis, understanding kind of what are the, from a data perspective, the challenges, where are we falling short, where are we underperforming as a system, bringing those together and turning those into, again, kind of that framing, the guiding principles, the vision of what we want to be at the end of this 20-year plan. We then adopted that to operationalize it and turned it into a means of prioritizing projects. So you can have all of the words and the visions and guiding principles, but unless you can actually translate that into something that you can use to make decisions and kind of assess trade-offs, then it doesn't do a whole lot for you from a planning perspective. So that's what we did through prioritization, turn that on a project list, and then we've delivered the Move Tucson plan, and I'll get more into that. So starting with kind of the visioning and background and the inventory of our network. So one of the things we looked at through the Move Tucson process was an existing condition summary. We wanted to understand what our core needs were. And I think we really learned some interesting things through this effort. And some of these are going to be surprising and some are going to be less surprising, I think. So kind of item 1A is that we've seen more than 1,700 people seriously injured or killed on Tucson streets between 2014 and 2018, which was the period of analysis for Move Tucson. And I can tell you, looking at the more recent data, that hasn't gotten better. It's actually going in the wrong direction. Since COVID, we've seen a really drastic increase in fatalities and serious injuries on our streets. What has been interesting about that is starting in about 2019, we've actually started to see a divergence between serious injuries and number of crashes. So actually the total number of crashes have been going down for about 3 or 4 years, but the impacts of those crashes are getting worse. So we're starting to see a higher number of severe injuries and a higher number of fatalities. Typically those two things move together, but now they're starting to diverge, with crashes going down and serious injuries going up. So that's a trend that has been kind of seen nationally. Particularly with the COVID pandemic, a lot of the shutdowns, the traffic volumes went down. And when traffic volumes went down, speeds went up. And that's why you see kind of that lower number of crashes, but higher number of severe injuries. I've also seen some theories that it has to do with the changing fleet of what's out there on the roadway. So you're starting to see a higher number of kind of large trucks, SUVs. They have very large square grills, and when those impact with a smaller vehicle or with a bicyclist or a pedestrian, they're far less forgiving than if you get hit by a sedan, say. So we've also seen that 90%, or during that period, pedestrian injuries and fatalities increased 90%. So that's been on our radar for a while, and it's only gotten more acute, I think, in the last 1 or 2 years, where we're seeing record numbers of pedestrian fatalities here in the city of Tucson. It now accounts for roughly 50% of all roadway fatals are pedestrians in the city, even though it's only about 10% of travel. So safety is kind of 1A. Also, 68% of the roads are in poor or failed condition. 40% of our major roadways lack accessible sidewalks on one or both sides. 92% of our roadways have a greater than a quarter mile between safe pedestrian crossings, meaning a hawk light, a traffic signal, some sort of traffic control to get across the road. 70% of major roadways, and these aren't your neighborhood streets, these are your Valencias and Broadways and Grant Roads, are considered high stress for bicyclists, and only 9% of our roadway network is congested during the peak hour. So we're trying to understand what is the real needs of the system, and from this evidence we can see that it's about condition, it's about safety, and it's about providing more options for people to travel comfortably and with dignity. And as I mentioned with the traffic fatalities, this is the numbers that we've been seeing up until 2020. We've been on a steady rise since 2016 for roadway fatals. And about 2018, we started to see actually that divergence where the number of crashes were going down, but the number of fatals were going up. We're about to see the 2021 data, but we already know it's going to continue this trend. And then the 2022 fatality data is looking worse still. So this continues to be a major challenge. not just here, everywhere, but particularly in our city. For those of you who haven't seen it, Smart Growth America, who is kind of the leading national organization on complete streets, just released a study called Dangerous by Design, in which they look at the pedestrian fatality rates. And nationally, we're seeing fatality rates that we haven't seen since the 1990s on our transportation system for pedestrians. Tucson, the Tucson metropolitan area has jumped up to the 13th highest rate of pedestrian fatalities in the country per 100,000 residents. So they look at it kind of comparing apples to apples, number of fatalities per 100,000. We used to be quite a bit lower on that list, but now we've climbed as high as 13. And that's a lot of the kind of the Sun Belt communities where you see that this issue is the most acute, those cities that grew up around the automobile. So Florida, I think, has 6 of the top 10 cities for pedestrian fatalities. Arizona has a number. Albuquerque is quite high. So we wanted to dig into that congestion number a bit. I mentioned that only 9% of our roadways were congested at peak hour during the day. So I think this was kind of counterintuitive, because oftentimes what we hear and kind of what the default assumption is for a lot of transportation planning is capacity, 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 capacity. And we really wanted to change that narrative with Move Tucson. So at any point during the day, only about 36 miles of our entire street network, which is 700 plus miles, exceeds 0.8 volume to capacity ratio at any time per day. And that's kind of the threshold you measure congestion at typically. And interestingly, traffic volumes are down since 2005. So we've been looking at the ADT numbers, and we hear people tell us, oh, traffic's getting so bad out there. But if we look at the data, the traffic collection that we've been doing since 2005, particularly in the center city, it's not quite the case in kind of the outlying areas. Excuse me. But in the center city, we've seen a decrease in traffic volumes, and that's been about a 15-year trend so far. And it's, going down by 0.5%, 1% a year. So we've got roadways like 5th, 6th Street that used to be 21,000 vehicles per day in the mid-90s, and now we're seeing 16,000 vehicles per day on that same stretch of roadway. And it's not that it's just gone down in 1 year. That's been an ongoing trend. And if we look at where we're collecting counts, 65% of our count locations are down by an average of 5% since 2005. And I think we do about 1,400 counts around the community. So if this is kind of the typical traffic volume pattern that you see in a lot of communities, and you see it in Tucson. So if you see it about 6:30 in the morning, your traffic volumes start to increase quite a bit. Levels out after 9, after the morning peak. That's why it's called the peak. Flat during midday, and then a little higher during the afternoon peak. So during the morning, less than half of our capacity is used, our total network capacity. And part of this is kind of directional. Either going one direction, they're coming home later in the afternoon in another direction. And then in the afternoon, only 55% of the street capacity is used during the day. So we did an analysis through Move Tucson, and looking at current volumes, we wanted to see where we had excess capacity. And we actually learned that we have about 194 miles of streets in the city of Tucson with excess capacity. That basically means that if we were to remove a travel lane from those roadways, they would still be operating below that 0.8 threshold of volume to capacity ratio at peak hour. So I think, and that's just today, but we also looked at it for the future. So part of the narrative, I think, here is that we don't have a congestion problem in the city of Tucson. We actually have excess capacity. I think a lot of the frustration stems from that Tucson is very unique in that 75% of our travel occurs on the signalized traffic, the signalized roadway network. In most major cities, it's about 50-50 between freeways with no signals and your signalized network. So Phoenix, I want to say, is like 40% on their signalized network, 60% on their freeway network. So it's not so much that there's capacity, it's more of an operational challenge because people are frustrated with those, those longer trips when they hit a number of traffic signals and can, kind of interpret that as congestion, whereas we actually have a lot of capacity on the network, but operationally, it can be frustrating for people who are making those longer trips in the community. So if we look out to 2045, this being a 20-year plan, you can see in the darker purple is the anticipated change between the current peak and the future peak based on our regional modeling data. So we're estimating a 19% increase in volumes and a 21% increase in miles traveled by 2045 based on the model outputs. However, even with this growth, we still have excess capacity, which is going from about 4 miles of excess capacity to 170 miles of excess capacity in 2045. So all of this is a long way of me saying that when we looked at that information, what went off for us through Move Tucson was that we're not trying to solve for a congestion issue. We have other needs in the city, very pressing needs in this city, but if we have to make those decisions and there's trade-offs to be made on a lot of our investments, that congestion alleviation isn't going to be the highest priority of how we make those decisions based on the needs and what the data are telling us. We also did an equity analysis for Move Tucson, and we identified those areas in the city, and it's largely this north-south spine out of downtown, where we have the highest concentration of what we call mobility vulnerable populations. And this is the concentrations of households in poverty, households without access to an automobile, where you have a higher concentration of people under 18 who probably don't have access to a private automobile, or less likely to, people over 65 who may be looking for other transportation options, people of color, and a couple other people with disabilities. And looked at all that, and we kind of looked at those areas of the city where you see those highest concentrations as a way of thinking about where do we want to make investments and where are kind of providing greater number of transportation choices more needed because people have fewer options for how they get around in the community. So that's really what this equity measure is, and it becomes a major component of our prioritization as we get into that step of the process.
Patrick, can I ask a couple of information questions?
Sure.
You mentioned V/C 0.8. I believe 0.8 refers to capacity. What is the V/C? It was on one of your slides.
Yeah, so that is volume to capacity ratio. So it is the volume of the vehicles over the estimated capacity of the roadway to handle those vehicles. So if you have a VC ratio of 1, it means that your volume per hour is exactly equal to the number of vehicles that can move through that roadway in an hour. But your operations at a VC of 1 are going to be gridlock, essentially. That you've maxed out. You can't put another car on that roadway. 80%, which would be 0.8, is about where you start to see some congestion, but you're not seeing that absolute gridlock. The vehicles are still moving, and there's an expectation that you're going to have slower movement at peak hour. And that's really what you see at about that VC8 level.
Okay. Thank you. Any other informational questions while we've got his attention? Anne, did you have something? It's like, okay, thanks, Patrick.
Well,
Yeah.
how do you measure the traffic flow? Do you have like cameras or little, how do you do that?
Yeah, so there's 2 ways to do it. We do collections every year. We don't, Pima Association of Governments contracts for it. And they do set up traffic cameras and they do kind of manual counts 2 days out of the year. So it's only a snapshot in time. I believe typically they do it in the fall when volumes are higher on our roadways. So the students are back, the seasonal residents are coming in. So we look at kind of the highest volume parts of the year. That is then used and it's inputted into a transportation model. So they take kind of that base volume and they use that based on the kind of the generators or what people are typically driving to, where the jobs are, where the houses are, how people tend to get around. That is the mode split. And they use that to project out to 2045 through sophisticated modeling software. And typically historically the models have overestimated, but it is a planning tool. So we really want to emphasize that the mindset is not just, I think there's a perception that people see that the transportation model says, congestion is going to be bad in the future, therefore widen roadway, right? But it's kind of one input into the considerations of what project priorities are. But that's a great question. And I'm not a PhD traffic modeler, so I won't get into the ins and outs of what goes into that model.
But the idea is that a 0.8 volumes of capacity is tolerable for an hour a day. Is that the idea, that you want less than that the rest of the day, or how is that computed?
Yeah, so we do typically look at the peak hour when thinking about if there are capacity constraints. When we're looking at individual projects, so this is kind of at a regional scale, we will drill down to individual projects when we're looking at specific improvements. And then we start to get into kind of duration, and there tends to be a determination of what is a tolerable threshold of congestion, kind of what is that comfortable pain threshold, as it were. And sometimes, we go above VC 0.8, but if it's only for 15 to 30 minutes a day, maybe that's an acceptable trade-off for the 23 and a half hours per day that facility is operating effectively, right? Because the decision you make is to then add capacity, which then if you're a bicyclist or a pedestrian or somebody on a bus, that's a less comfortable way to travel for the remaining 90% of that day.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's one more kind of element of this too, is that we look at intersections and segments separately. So we can also measure kind of the backup at intersections based on the timing of those signals, and estimate the amount of wait time there is at a traffic signal. So we use something called level of service. And if you're seeing level of service E, it means basically you're waiting more than like 60 to 70 seconds on average to get through a given traffic signal. So that's another consideration when we're looking at these projects. But at that regional scale, that big citywide scale, we tend to just kind of keep it at a generalized volume to capacity. So equity, and then public engagement. All right. So we kicked off Move Tucson with a larger public event in February of 2020. And our intention with this effort was to really do a more on the ground kind of public engagement effort. Really coming out to where people are. We wanted to do tabling at grocery stores, intercepts on buses, going out to parks. Came up with a whole suite of strategies to make sure that we really got broad and representative participation, so that what we were hearing from the residents of Tucson really reflected the sentiments of the residents of Tucson, and not just hearing from a kind of a subset of residents who tend to be more engaged, more active in these types of efforts, because it can be hard to really motivate people to participate in something that can be a little bit more abstract. It's not an immediate need. It's not an immediate threat, in the way that some specific transportation projects can be. It is kind of a generalized, long range, down the road effort. So people are like, I don't need to think about that right now. Well, about 3 weeks after starting, everything in the city shut down, and we were doing all of this outreach right in the heart of kind of the COVID pandemic in 2020. So we we canceled all of that. We canceled all in-person meetings. We canceled all of that outreach, but we still wanted to address those goals of making sure that we hear from everybody to the best of our ability. So one way we did that is through the Complete Streets Coordinating Council. This is the implementing body and the public oversight committee of our Complete Streets policy, as well as the Move Tucson effort. They continue to meet monthly. Those are open public meetings. If you would like to attend and sit in on those, you're welcome to it. There's voting committee members, but the public is welcome to attend and observe. And if there's time to take questions, we'll also engage with questions. So with this group, we went full virtual. We canceled all of our meetings and continued to meet with them virtually. So they provided a lot of the kind of month-to-month oversight guidance to the Move Tucson process. We wanted to make sure that we had that check-in with the citizens body. We also took all of our intention for what we were doing in person and tried to do that virtually to varying degrees of success, I would say. So we shifted a lot of our project budget and we pushed that into promotions, advertising, virtual meetings, and other methods. So we developed a couple PSA style promotions to really encourage people to engage with us on the website, to reach out to us. Those were both through Spanish and English media. We hosted bilingual virtual town hall events. That was all new for us. Now everybody's very comfortable with that. At the time, we didn't know what we were doing. So some of them went better than others, I will certainly say. We did virtual meetings. We made ourselves available to all the neighborhood associations to do sessions like this, engage with the ward offices to see if they get the word out to their constituents, used a lot of social media, directly called a lot of neighborhood leaders. And then we did something that was new that we piloted with the city I want to talk a bit about is we worked with a street ambassador program. And that was something that we stood up for this effort, but we ended up working with them in a different way. So the street ambassador model is basically identifying or recruiting residents who have kind of strong social networks in areas of your community where you typically see the highest barriers to public participation in these types of efforts. So we looked at our equity analysis and we knew that these were the areas that we needed to recruit people from because we're typically going to see lower levels of participation in those areas of the city for a myriad of reasons. So we put out the call and we got these 10 volunteers who we were able to offer a small stipend to for their efforts. And we really wanted to work with them to kind of be a captain to get out the word on Move Tucson to their coworkers, their neighbors, family members, et cetera, and really recognize that it would be a more kind of comfortable setting in talking to folks that you know that are from your neighborhood as opposed to somebody from the city kind of hosting a public open house and saying, come on out and tell us what's important to you. So it's another means of reaching out. And this is actually a model that we've now expanded upon and have been using for subsequent public engagement efforts. But this was the first time that we did this. So initially, we thought that they could be hosting like small cafecitos where they'd be, convening small groups of their neighbors in their living room and talking to them about kind of their transportation needs and et cetera, et cetera. We had to kind of move away from that with the pandemic, but they came up with some great ways to be able to engage with people separately. And I'll talk about that in a second. So about halfway through our public engagement process, we paused and we wanted to see if we were being successful in kind of replicating our We Come to You approach virtually and hearing, from the entire city. And it turns out we weren't. Basically, by going virtual, it just kind of reinforced the patterns that we historically see, where you see a lot of engagement in kind of these areas of the city, but a lot less engagement in these areas of the city. So broadly, these areas circled in red kind of represent where we were seeing low levels of participation that were below the share of these zip codes population in the city, if that makes sense. So if 85706 is 1% of the city's population, we would want to see 1% of the responses to the surveys and the other effort, means of public engagement coming from that area. But in this case, we did that analysis and maybe only 0.3% of the response rate was coming from that particular zip code. That's just an example, so we really wanted to hone in on those areas that were kind of underrepresented in our data, because then we weren't showing kind of representative feedback from the city. So we did is we worked closely with the street ambassadors. They came up with their own means of reaching out to people, and we targeted specifically those zip codes where we weren't seeing participation. So we shifted all of our engagement resources into those, how many is it? 6 zip codes essentially. So they came up with some cool stuff. So a lot of them did their own social media efforts, and it was really important that we didn't try to control any of the messaging. We weren't developing any of this. It was basically, use your voice, use your Instagram and TikTok and Facebook, and put out your message to kind of encourage your followers, your friends to participate in this effort. And the city really took a hands-off approach on that. They were volunteers. They knew how to communicate with people. this was cool. Somebody actually went out and did like sidewalk chalking at a farmer's market. So just an alternative way of getting the message out. So we knew where people were going to be congregating. It was socially distanced, it was open air, and then they were just getting that message out, kind of guerrilla marketing to get people to, you know, be interested in the Move Tucson effort. We worked with the ward offices and we were doing mask distribution. The street ambassadors worked with their ward representative and got a bunch of Move Tucson materials out through the mask distributions in Ward 5 and Ward 1 and Ward 3. So that was super cool. And they had lots of swag. So walking around with the Move Tucson bag over here and getting the word out. So that was great. So then we really started to see momentum building in those areas where we saw lower levels of participation. And then the final effort we did is we took, again, shifted some more of the Move Tucson resources and actually did worked with a survey firm to kind of close the gap. And that was the final piece of that, is we said, all right, looking at our percentages, this is the final kind of group that we need to contact. So I think we ended up contracting for about 1,000 telephone surveys, and just said basically it needs to be people in this area of the city. So target these specific zip codes and these specific demographics where we have a lack of participation representation. And at the end of that, what we ended up seeing was a distribution of participation in Move Tucson that accurately reflected kind of the city of Tucson, which is super cool for a non kind of scientific survey approach, and something I'm particularly proud of. So it gives us confidence that what we heard back from the residents, you know, reflects what the residents of the community actually want, instead of a particular group of folks.
Hey, Patrick, can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
How did your department fund the community engagement process? And did you have, sounds like you hired some consultants or had some local stakeholder groups that were helping you implement that outreach. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the outreach was built into the Move Tucson process. So it was a $500,000 planning effort, and it was funded through HERF, the state gas tax. The city of Tucson gets a distribution of that, and it's very flexible in terms of it can be used for overhead, for projects, for staff, or planning processes, efforts like this. So we used our HERF funds to do it. And we had some of the engagement was built into the contract. So the consultant team led that. They were called Alta Planning and Design. You can see their little logo right down here. They're actually a national planning firm, and they're a leader in kind of bike and pedestrian designs and bike and pedestrian planning. So I think even at the outside of this, we were kind of thinking about what we wanted this plan to be. We then supplemented that, and we put a lot of staff hours into that engagement as well. So a lot of staff folks were out there making those calls, doing those presentations, setting up those events. And then for the survey, which, you know, you're going to contract for that, had a pretty significant cost. We actually had to move money from one part of our kind of overall master plan contract to really emphasize and focus on that engagement. So that's where the funding came from. So we had to kind of sacrifice other parts of the planning process to make sure that we were doing the engagement part right.
Quick follow-up. I don't want to delay things, but how many staff, internal staff in the department were involved in the project? Full-time equivalents, I guess.
Yeah. So largely it was Andy Bemis and I who were the two project leads on this. And I would say each of us were probably doing half-time on this process. So I would say one FTE perhaps, but split between us. And then we would, other staff would help out and support staff as needed. We would, you know, get input from some of our engineering folks and kind of those more informal inputs. But in terms of actually managing and day-to-day operations, it was two of us.
Thank you.
So in terms of what we heard from the community, and if I'm running over time, just let me know. Am I going too long here?
You're doing great, Patrick. I think it helps when we break with questions like these. So let's just find out if anyone else has accumulated this thing that they want to ask.
Looks like Laura has her hand up.
Great, Laura.
I was just going to say all this stuff about the process is indeed very interesting. And I'm hoping we'll spend at least as much time on the results as we are on the process. Just putting out a hope. That's all. You don't have to respond to that. Just, yeah.
We're now getting into the results.
At all.
We are. This is the results.
Oh, great.
Oh, we're now going to get. I thought you said we're not going to get.
No. All right. And that will remain a mystery. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day. So what we did hear from the community is basically 58% of the respondents all that effort supported a more balanced transportation system. As I talked about earlier, that means kind of rethinking how we make our investments to rebalance the system. And then when we said, you know, what should we prioritize? This was an interesting one. 42% said they want better crosstown mobility. 37%, and these are the highest amounts. It doesn't have to be a majority, but these were the highest rate because they had about 10 options. 37% want a more sustainable city. 37% wanted to prioritize safety. 35% walking, biking, and public transportation, and 32% maintenance. And then we got more specific in terms of those were the broad priorities, but actually when it came to how do you want to invest your transportation dollars, you do see a slight misalignment here with kind of what we heard from like that crosstown mobility and what the priorities are here. And that most important ways to invest were improving roadway and safety, roadway crossings and safety for people walking and biking, repaving our streets, building more accessible sidewalks, improving traffic signal timing, and building safe, more connected bikeways. The least important in terms of how we invest our dollars would be to widen roadways and to slow driving speeds. So we turned all of that then into Tucson's transportation vision. I won't read all of that, but I think it accurately reflects kind of what we heard from the data as well as from the residents of Tucson. And that is we want to reduce barriers and enable opportunities for all of us by increasing transportation choices, improving safety on our network, and investing in the infrastructure we already have instead of expanding the infrastructure that we have. So basically, yeah, more into alternative modes of transportation or active modes of transportation, more into accessibility, more into maintenance and pavement, and kind of modernizing our existing network to increase those choices. And then we went further and we turned that into a set of guiding principles, which we're going to then operationalize into a prioritization process. And that is authentic, safe, connected, equitable, optimized, and resilient. And there's more information under each of these. I won't get into that right now, but essentially kind of these are how we wanted to prioritize our transportation investments based on what we heard from Move Tucson. So the next step is then we have kind of our direction, what's important, what the guiding philosophy is. Now it comes to identifying the specific projects. So we ended up identifying about 256 projects for Move Tucson from a variety of sources. And these were from kind of deficiencies from the existing conditions analysis, the public input we received from Move Tucson. So not only did we hear about kind of those broad goals, people also told us very specific projects and very specific needs that were on the network. And from many of our existing modal plans we drew from. So we have the Bike Boulevard Master Plan, we have the Pima Regional Trails Plan, we have the Regional Mobility Plan, we have the Pedestrian Safety and Accessibility Plan. And we pulled all of that in because instead of building out a cost-constrained plan at the beginning, what we wanted to do was put everything on the table and run it through a prioritization process that was based on those guiding principles that came out of the public input and out of our analysis of the data. So when we looked at these different guiding principles, you can see how we prioritize them. So we looked at connected and basically how many modal networks can be further improved or supported. That is there pedestrian deficiencies, are there bikeway deficiencies, are there transit investments we can make? And if they are closing kind of a network gap for any of those networks, that project would get 10 points, or that segment of project optimized. Can we right size our roadways. Basically, this is the one, are there bottlenecks or congestion, or is there excess capacity? If the project is addressing one of those issues, it got 10 points. Safe, we double weighted safety based on the information. So does the roadway have a history of serious crashes? That is, we looked at if there were fatals and serious. And then the second way we looked at it was, does it have a high number of crashes? Because we assume that, you know, where you have a high volume of crashes that aren't necessarily resulting in severe crashes, they are potential severe crashes. So there were 20 points available for these two different ways of looking at safety. Resilient, can the network better support short local trips? Basically, are they within kind of high activity areas that are within walking and biking distance for most people, and prioritizing those as we look to shift and kind of reduce carbon emissions. And then equitable, we double weighted that. So we added up all of these, and then we double weighted if it was in one of our equity focus areas. Basically, is it providing those transportation choices for people who have fewer options for how they get around? And that became a major driver of what the system, you know, what kind of came out as the high priorities. So we segmented the entire transportation system, and we applied that prioritization score to the entire network, segment by segment. And you can see this kind of grayed out area. These are the high equity areas, or the transit mobility focus areas under gray here. So those are the areas that got the double weighting. So you see that the red is the lower scoring and the blue to purple is the higher scoring. So that's the entire network we have a segment priority score on. The next thing we had to do is then overlay that onto the project lists. And basically the projects have overlap a number of transportation segments. I won't get too much into the details of this. And then we had to assign a final score to be able to take the guiding principles and turn it into a prioritization score for each of those 256 projects within Move Tucson. So this is just to illustrate how that worked. A modernization project on Speedway Boulevard is one of our projects. And you can see each of these segments within on Speedway Boulevard have a different priority score. We then did a weighted average of those priority scores to come up with a final kind of prioritization for this particular project. So we ultimately ended up coming up with these 256 projects prioritized into 3 tiers. And you can see that the purple is the high tier, high priority projects in Move Tucson. A lot of these then end up overlapping with those equity focus areas in the plan, because that double weighting became so important in that consideration. So what we're doing now is basically taking those projects and looking at how to implement them. So that was one of the outcomes. I hope that was addressed. And I would invite you to go to movetucson.org, and you can see each of these individual projects, what the priority score is, and if we received any public comments on them. So we also had to look at kind of system-wide capital needs or capital improvement needs. So those project lists are what we were calling the network improvements that are location specific. Basically, it has a defined geography. It's a roadway that goes from here to here, and we've identified a number of improvements on it. Oh, I did want to say one more thing about this. So a lot of these projects are aligning on our corridors. Based on the input we received, very, very few of these are capacity projects. Almost every one of these is a safety-focused, what we call modernization or complete streets project. So if we take like Prince Road or Fort Lowell, the project description is add lighting, add safe crossings, add enhanced bike lanes, build out this pedestrian network, incorporate green infrastructure, essentially. The only really expansion projects are a lot in this area of the city where we're seeing fast growth, and we have a lot of kind of 2-lane, 3-lane, almost rural type facilities. And there's a lot of growth pressure out here. So there's a couple widenings and expansion out here, but most of these are actually just modernization projects, as we're calling them. So I think very different than what we saw in like our previous RTA or current RTA plan. So those are about $5.7 billion in need that we identified in those location-specific projects. We also looked at system-wide kind of maintenance needs to get a full understanding of what the totality of the need for investment on Tucson's transportation system is over the 20 years. And we came up with a number of about $13 billion. This is an aspirational number. There's no way we're ever going to be able to, we don't have $13 billion over 20 years to be able to invest in our transportation system, but we wanted to understand that whole need. And a lot of that is, we've got $1.5 billion in need to repair pavement, 200 million in neighborhood street improvements, and these are like safety, traffic calming, and a number of other of these. The big one is also public transit. So if we wanted to build out our frequent transit network over 20 years, we're looking at $4.6 billion in investment in our public transportation system. There's also a number of policies and programs that I won't get into, but one of the ones that we got a lot of feedback is updating our major streets and routes plan. If any of you are familiar with the MS&R plan, it basically requires minimum setbacks from our roadways, which is why a lot of the urban form of Tucson is roadway, and then, a quarter mile until you see the front of the building. So revisiting our major streets and routes plan to see if we can reduce those setbacks, because that becomes a very hostile environment to pedestrians when your setbacks are that big, and that's mandated by our own code. So as I mentioned, that 13 billion is really an aspirational number. What we did then is we came up with some funding scenarios and actually came up with a recommended funding level, which is equivalent to about 7 billion over those 20 years, which is still a big number, but it is more achievable. It would require us to increase transportation funding from about 50% over baseline. So the yellow bar here represents our current funding across these different categories. Based on what we heard from Move Tucson, these are the recommended funding levels. So we're spending about $100 million a year on location-specific kind of named capital projects. Move Tucson recommends we increase that by 48%, and that would be enough to deliver all of those tier 1 high priority projects within a 20-year planning, or within this 20-year horizon, about $160 million equivalent per year of investment. Increasing public transit investment by 34%, pavement by 20%, and on down the list. So this, with the project list, are the major outcomes, I think, of Move Tucson, and we can use this to really frame and think about our future transportation expenditures and how we budget for investments.
Patrick, we're going to break at 11 just for 5 minutes.
Okay. So I've gone way too long.
I'm not sure that's true. I think this is very interesting. I wanted to give us a chance, though, to ask a question or two, and I'll see that process. The details are very fascinating, and so too is this process whereby you approached this whole issue.
Yeah.
What aspects of the model would you like to see the city and other regional entities replicate?
Yeah. So I think we're starting to see that a little bit now. The model's controlled at the regional level. It's by Pima Association of Governments, and they use what's called a traditional 4-step model, which really prioritizes and isn't very sensitive to alternative modes of transportation. So I would love to see something, and I don't know how capable they are of doing this right now, but that better can represent and model kind of bike and pedestrian trips to get a better sense of, if we make investments in a certain way, is that going to result in potentially more of a mode shift? Because basically they kind of take the baseline and project it into the future for what the mode share is for those modes.
Okay. And especially thinking about this very intensive public outreach process and having the advisory committee that continues to meet with you apparently monthly. Mm-hmm. How much do you think this is a good model for planning for the city and for the county to just start that way and to really do an articulated investigation of people's needs and wishes before going to the professional planners?
Yeah, and I think it's always part of a dialogue between kind of marrying the technical assessment with what people's desires are and turning that into a specific set of outcomes. And in this case, I think we saw really close alignment between what the residents were telling us and what the data was telling us. So it made our job easy. But I will say that it's a high priority for the city right now to make sure that we are doing that equitable public engagement. So we're looking to bring on people for Plan Tucson. We're going to be doing the citywide master plan update, the long range plan. And I think that they are going to look at potentially using some of these models. We've continued to use the street ambassador model in a couple other places. We're doing what's called Tucson Norte Sewer right now, which is planning for transit-oriented development on that north-south spine. And it's really kind of intensive community outreach for that process before any decisions are made. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
That's a good start. And let's see if anyone else has got any questions.
See that Trace has a question.
Thanks, Kevin.
Hi, Patrick. I'm not even sure where to start. On the location-specific improvements, I believe you said you're currently spending roughly $100 million a year or over 20 years.
So that's kind of the annualized average.
Okay.
That we're spending about 100 million. And a lot of those are delivering the current RTA projects.
What kinds of projects are being funded?
Yeah, so I did want to show you this really quick. When I talk about modernization, I've got a few examples if you can indulge me really quickly. So when we're talking about modernization, this is what we're talking about. So this is Grande, this is the existing conditions. This is kind of the Move Tucson project concept. So these are the modernization projects. It's bringing in more vegetation, widening and making the sidewalks accessible, building out, buffer to protected bike lanes, narrowing up your travel lanes, and kind of investing in those transportation choices more so. So these are the types of projects that we're thinking about for Move Tucson. This is Prince Road. So it's taking the current condition, sidewalk gaps, 11-foot travel lanes, 5-foot bike lanes, kind of a auto-centric, unprotected marked crosswalk, and turning it into something more like this. So these are the projects that we're proposing with Move Tucson, not taking a roadway from 4 to 6 lanes, continuous sidewalks. Here's another example, lacking sidewalks.
For all of these non-car alternatives is where's the destination? I noted when I looked at the priority projects, it seems that sidewalks along major streets that were miles from any place anyone would want to get to seem to be among the highest priorities. And did I misread that?
No, because a lot of those specific sidewalk projects that were lacking other investments. So if that makes sense. So for example, sidewalks are built into all of those corridor projects. So let me go back here. So all of these are going to have sidewalk updates. There's a few projects that are the only deficiency that was identified on that corridor was some sort of sidewalk or pedestrian investment. And those are the ones that we did a screening for to see where there were gaps that weren't covered by another Move Tucson project and didn't have ADA accessible pedestrian facilities, essentially. And those were those ones that showed up. So it's like, I imagine it's like South 6. One of them was this Calle Santa Cruz out here that showed up as a pedestrian project. So, yeah.
Is there any value in putting $1 million a mile of sidewalks in a project where nobody wants to walk?
No. So I will say that the prioritization process isn't going to answer every question for us. There's also going to have to be when we finalize that investment and, kind of passing the common sense test. So if I have $1 million to spend on sidewalks and my choice is between Calle Santa Cruz and, near a school or on country club or something, I'm going to prioritize that location.
Okay.
Wow, great questions and great answers. Let's take our 5-minute break and we can pause the recording and we'll be back. By my clock, it says 11:07, but go on your own clock. We'll just resume. So rather than trying to squeeze in a review process on what Patrick has shared, let's be ample and easy in our timing and go right into Christy and Bridget would like at least 10 minutes. Why don't we all take notes of one sort or another and really notice something that you find interesting, whether it's a fact or a story or an idea, or just the way that they manage their presentation. And let's give them really concrete feedback on what they've done. And concrete can sometimes be, well, gee, I was waiting for, I was waiting for the overview and it never happened. And we tell them, and that's just feedback for them. But let's find out what they've got. And we're going to break at about 11:50 from that. Does that sound good, Christine? Yeah, until 11:50. All right.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my. Oh, can I share my screen? I have my.
Yes, I just have to make you a co-host.
Okay.
Okay, you should be able to now.
Thank you. Okay. How about, can you guys see my slides? Okay, perfect. Oh, I don't know what I'm doing. Hold on. Where's... Also, I need 5 seconds because my computer is going to shut off.
Don't do that.
Oh no. Sorry, thank you. All right, Christy, I am ready to start flipping through the slides whenever.
Okay, well, I will start speaking. We'll see if I show up as on the screen, but I decided to talk to you about desert foods by Basa, and I will define that on the next slide, Bridget.
Okay.
So what did the natives and indigenous people eat before the white folks arrived here? We know there were some agriculturalists later, but mostly they were hunter-gatherers. Baja Arizona Sustainable Agriculture was formed as a nonprofit 501c3 in 2005. They started the Bisbee and Sierra Vista farmers markets. Also acquired a Meadow Mills hammer mill in 2010 and has conducted annual autumn millings at both the Bisbee and Sierra Vista markets. Throughout the year, we regularly visit both markets to promote local native food, such as mesquite pods, prickly pear fruits, and more. Now, right off, Bridget asked me, did you form it? I said, no, not me. But it was extensively in our newspapers in that time frame, and I was at the first mesquite milling in Sierra Vista. I soon after became a volunteer, and I've been on the board for 5 years. Our mission statement is to help create and expand local sustainable food systems in Southern Arizona that promote health and well-being of the natural world and the people who live here. Baja Arizona is dedicated to educating the public on the importance of a sustainable food and agriculture system that is economically viable, environmentally sound, socially just, and humane. Next slide. So we do an annual fall mesquite milling. We do it in the fall because we needed low humidity. A hammer mill is very effective at getting the most nutrition out of the hammer mill, or out of the mesquite pod, sorry, and it certainly beats using the rock and mortar and pedestal that people used to do. So on the left, we're in Bisbee at the farmer's market. And on the right, we are prepping the hammer mill for training and getting it ready for the year. Next slide. The top upper corner, I have a shadow box, I call it. I leave it right out front on the table and people will stop and look at it. Our native mesquites are the velvet mesquite, Proscopus velvetino. They are native to southern Arizona. We also have a lot of honey mesquite pods to the right of the upper screen. They're much lighter and they are native to southern Texas. Then I think on there, you can see the velvets come in all ranges of colors. We have Chilean mesquites, not as hardy, low root system on them, but they grow fast and they're put in a lot of the new housing areas. On the bottom, I have the two types of Palo Verdes that we have, the blue and the foothills, and that is our state tree. And in the middle, I have some acacia pods, which are possibly edible. On the right upper is Basa at the Tucson Sustainable Festival. About 3 years ago, we tabled. There on the lower right, left side, we are sorting through the pods, checking for twigs and rocks and bad pods so that they don't get into the hammer mill and get into the flour. And here's a typical table setup of us at the market. Next slide. We have our annual milling, but we also love Earth Day and we celebrate that at both markets. We bring in native foods, we have food samples, we have solar cooking and much more. This year at both markets, we had a really fun solar cook-off, which was open to anybody to bring their ovens and cook. So we do promote that as an alternative way to cook. Next slide. Education is primary. Most people simply rake up mesquite pods and throw them away, but they know little about the food and the nutritional values. So we are regularly at the farmers markets. It's a nice outdoor location. We went to the Empire Ranch Cowboy Festival. We hold talks at community gardens. I've taught at Bisbee Science Lab and I'll be doing that again this year, and tutoring programs. So it's really important for children too, that they learn what the foods are of the desert. Next slide. And now I'm gonna pass it off to Bridget and I'll help with questions. I am thrilled that she got so into this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. And I think I want to just start off with saying, and building off of what Christy told us, like people have been living off of this land for hundreds and hundreds of years, like the Tohono O'odham tribe. And I just wanted to highlight that they did some floodplain agriculture during the monsoon summer season. They did a lot of harvesting of wild cactus, seeds, nuts, and they hunted off this land. And I'm sure that they also, taught people, settlers when they moved here, on how to live off this land. And a lot of their staples included the tepary beans, squash, melon, chilies, cholla buds, prickly pears, the mesquite beans, rabbits, and javelinas. And if you want to learn more about them, they sometimes, there's different types of events that you can go to. And I think we just had the annual Southwest Native Foods Gathering. And coming up on August 20th, there is a traditional O'odham agriculture teaching event at Mission Garden, and I can always share links to that later. Anyways, kind of building off of what Christy was talking about, there are so many edible plants in the Sonoran Desert. There's estimated to be at least 540 of them, and those are the ones that we know of. And I kind of just wanted to highlight some of the different edible plants that you can harvest and forage for during different seasons. So this past spring, and I'm sure many of you have seen these types of plants or weeds. either when you're walking out through your neighborhood or just in your yard. But we have the Palo Verde, and those pods can be harvested when they're green and when they're still immature, and they taste a lot like edamame, is what I've read about. We have the yucca blooms as well. During the summer, we have choyas. You can eat the choya buds, and also prickly pears. And the prickly pear, you can eat the fruit on there and the pads, which are also called nopales and tunas. During the autumn, you can harvest the barrel cactus fruit and pigweed, which tends to grow really well after all these monsoon rains. And during the winter, there's London rocket and mallow. And I know London rocket isn't necessarily native, but has been introduced to this area, and grows and near any type of like source of water. So you can actually find them pretty populated during next to like highways or riverbanks. Didn't have enough time to like obviously talk about all of them, but I really wanted to highlight the mesquite tree because it really is a magical tree that just gives and gives. Not only does it produce its pods, but there's also the mesquite sap, which has been used medicinally before, or even just kind of as an adhesive adhesive type. Anyways, a little bit of information and facts. Like Christy said, the velvet mesquite are the native trees to southern Arizona. The legumes are almost about 40% protein, which is twice as high as other beans and legumes, which is pretty incredible. It is high in minerals such as calcium, magnesium, potassium, iron, and the amino acid lysine. And for how much nutrients it has, it's only about 30 calories per 2 tablespoons of mesquite flour. It's high in fiber. We got 3 grams of fiber and 1 gram of protein and 6 grams of carbs. Because it's high in fiber, it slows digestion and it doesn't cause high blood sugar spikes. So it's very beneficial for people with diabetes to be eating this, especially since it can have a naturally like sweet flavor. It's low on the glycemic index. It's 25 on there, and it is naturally gluten-free, which makes it a great option for people that are allergic to gluten, have celiacs, and maybe are allergic to other types of nut flours. And you can eat mesquite in a plentiful ways. Like you can eat the pods right off of the tree under the right conditions, of course. You got to make sure that there's no like bacteria growing on them, but they're edible off of the tree. They can be boiled to make atole. And as Christy mentioned, they can be dried and grounded. And once they're made into their flour, they can be used for a multitude of things, such as tortillas, baked goods like cookies, cakes, sauces, pancakes, and more. And that's kind of what I wanted to highlight with some of the pictures. We have cookies on the top right corner. We have mesquite ice cream, cinnamon mesquite ice cream, and tortillas. I also wanted to highlight the prickly pear cactus because I'm Mexican. I went to Mexico a lot for my childhood. And even though I knew what like nopales were, I actually didn't know that the prickly pear fruit were tunas. And I was kind of surprised when I was doing all this research on knowing that I've been eating them my whole life, and I didn't fully know that. Anyways, it's very nutritious, but of course, the nutritional value varies by species, season, and age of the plant. The pads are about 90% water, so they're very hydrating. They have vitamin C, beta carotene, and little carbs or fat. And the fruit is about 85% water, 6 to 8% glucose, and it is low in the glycemic index. So also doesn't cause large sugar spikes. And how you can eat them. Again, multiple ways you can eat this type of this food. So the nopales can be boiled, roasted, grilled, pickled, and added to a multitude of things such as scrambled eggs, can be made into salads. And then that can be added to tortillas for tacos. The flowers are also very beneficial. They can be made into tea, which have been shown to be anti-inflammatory and antibacterial. And the fruit, when it's matured, can be easily picked off. You have to remove the thorns, but they can either be frozen or steamed to make juice, syrup, jellies, wines, margaritas, whatever you're feeling. So not only are these edible plants, you know, great for us humans, but they also really feed the earth. Mesquite, Palo Verdes, and ironwood trees are considered nitrogen fixing trees. And essentially what they do is they have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria colonies in the soil. And that bacteria enables the tree to convert atmospheric nitrogen, and that fixes that nitrogen into the soil. And that is crucial for anything to grow. That's not a natural process that happens. Like, we need these types of trees in order to feed the soil. And yeah, that allows the tree and the nearby plants to thrive. Not only do they do that, but they also provide shade to their nearby plant neighbors, and that conserves water. And Christy mentioned when we were talking that the saguaros actually use these trees' shade to grow under when they're young in order to grow up essentially and become more resilient to the desert environment. And, you know, not only are these like trees great in their multitudes of ways, but they're also very drought resistant. They've evolved to live in the Sonoran Desert. And as we go into a world where we face more uncertainty with water, they're so important to be able to provide shade, to conserve the water that we have. And they're adapted to do that. They have, like mesquite trees have deep roots in order to really access that underground water. Anyways, just like kind of a few questions that maybe people have, you know, how do I go about gathering or foraging these edible plants? And before anyone does that, please do your research. Please really learn about the environment, what you can and can't eat. But once you get past that, you can always see what's in your yard or what's in your neighborhood. You can harvest off of BLM lands, and you can also ask private property owners if you can pick their trees or their plants if they don't intend to do that. And I think that's a great opportunity to also inform them of the literal like free food that they have growing on their yards. And I also, you know, I ask people to go check out their local food co-ops, like the Xanax Xavier Food Co-op. I know you can find cholla buds and mesquite flower there sometimes, and just a multitude of things that they have, which is awesome. And here are some great resources that everyone can check out, and I'm happy to also email them. But there's obviously bostonmesquite.org, which has great information on there. Desert Harvesters is also amazing. And we have the Southwest Foraging book, Eat Mesquite and More, A Desert Feast, and the Prickly Pear Cookbook. And that's kind of our wrap up. If there's any questions, but really just be like this turtle and go eat some Sonoran desert food.
Let's see if we've got any questions.
I think I'm curious. Oh, I'm sorry. Trace raised his hand and I just started talking.
Sorry, Martin.
You're very polite, Trace. I was wondering about the milling machine and how much something like that costs, like what kind of investment that is, just for curiosity's sake.
Sure. Bridget, can you go ahead and take the slides off for a sec so we can see each other?
Yes.
Cool. I like to see. So a hammer mill, back when we bought ours, was about $5,000. And all the ranchers and people that were original board members chipped in and bought it. Sits on a trailer so it can go. It's now valued at $10,000 to $12,000. Currently, so you know, Martha, Desert Harvesters is selling their hammer mill. It's tough. I mean, they have to pay for storage. They have to pay people to operate it. And we are totally a volunteer run board, not as a nonprofit too. And we have a safe, secure, free place to store. So, you know, we don't make a lot of money. We have a very low budget. So initially, yeah, there's an investment. There is no known commercial mills here, except that from being at Mission Gardens last year, the Tohono O'odham College has their own mill. There are other people that own their own mills and mill for like the co-op, that kind of thing. Syria Indians mill. But if you go to buy mesquite flour online, for example, most of it comes from South America, Peru, Argentina.
Wow.
Hard to find.
So interesting, because like I have friends in Spain and in Italy, they do this too, like in the wine regions where it's like they have a local, you know, their regions have a local, I don't know, wine press, olive oil making press, whatever. And all the little agricultural people just, and I think traditionally, even in Great Britain, they did this, right? Everyone takes their little whatever and gets the percentage of the total output based on what they put in, right? So it's like these little community nodes where they're all participating in the production of that local wine, or they're all participating in the production of that local olive oil, because something like that, obviously at an individual level isn't sustainable, but through little community nodes is awesome.
Yeah, mesquite can be very tricky to get into flour. You can easily break your blender. So we mill flour, like a gallon of flour would cost anywhere in Southern Arizona, $2 to $3 a gallon. And you would get a pound of flour for that. And that would sell retail for $15, $16. So you're basically saving yourself a lot of money, collecting your own pods, feeding yourself for a fraction of the cost of buying it wherever you can find it, which is can be tricky. So in that way, we are a community resource. We have not raised our prices for millings. And I think in Phoenix, they were charging $6 a pound to mill flour. I was like, really? Why? I mean, but yes, it is something that we have regulars every year, but then we get new people. So.
All right, well, let's take one more question from Trace.
Christy and Bridget, thank you very much. This was a nice presentation. Two questions. Have you attempted to estimate how much food we could produce here, and any thoughts on how we can promote people actually eating all these wonderful local foods?
Bridget, take a stab at it, because all I can say, Trace, is it's very, we just in the last few years started quantitating how much flour we produce. So, and with nobody in Tucson milled this year, nobody.
Wow.
We had 5 hammer mills at Mission Gardens. I expect we'll have quite a turnout, and we probably would mill a couple 100 pounds of flour. A lot of people will use their own setups, but it would, and it's a growing process in Patagonia. Remember that, Bridget, with the Borderlands? They got a big grant and did a lot of education on how mesquite could save the Borderlands with Gary Naban and other people. So something to think about, that they're thinking ahead into the future of what food is available and how to use it. And I mean, getting to the young people, getting to markets, that's about all I can do. Do you have ideas, Bridget?
Yeah, you know, I didn't really look into an estimation number of how much we can feed, but I completely agree with what you said, Christy. And I think really like the biggest hurdle right now is just having knowledge of the fact that you can eat these legumes off of mesquite trees, and that's just a small sliver of all the edible food that we have here. I would personally love to see like social media campaigns, more focus on local farmers markets and having that information more available. And that's kind of like what I can think of. That's like a low cost thing that we can do, like just really promoting it on social media. Like I think about every like superfood that comes out and it becomes a big hit sensation, like chia seeds, and just really educating people on like, oh, hey, we have mesquite trees everywhere in southern Arizona, at least, and they're a superfood in their own self, and they're very drought resistant. And yeah, I would just love to see more educational campaigns on that.
Christy and Bridget, if you have a chance, can you provide your slide deck to Stuart so he can then send it out to us when he does an announcement next week?
And let me quickly address the topic of solar cooking. I think even when we were in Tucson for the Sustainable Festival, someone else was using the sun ovens, and they're very good. But sun ovens have gone from a couple $100 cost to over $400 now. The last ones we bought, as we were a distributor for Southern Arizona, they were $300. So it's not an easy investment, but they do last a long time. There's now another oven, a Soul Cook, which is portable. And there's many more choices out there if you just search solar cooker. But the sun ovens are solid, good solid ovens. Anna?
Can I just ask a quick question? Where do you buy a sun oven? Where's the best place?
Right now, I would say buy it online because I don't know of any distributors in our area. I used to haul them back and forth to the markets all the time.
Okay.
But I just can't sell them at $400 and some dollars. It's just prohibitive. But they are part of a global movement because they do make village sun ovens so that women don't have to go gather wood and cook over it. And so their cause is good. Yeah, I mean, they do. So we're all supporting that with our money. Laura?
Yeah, thank you both so much for this labor of love and information.
There's more questions, Stuart.
Okay, I'm watching the clock, but Laura.
Oh, I just have a very quick question. Is there still an annual solar cook-off or whatever it was called up on Catalina State Park every spring? That went on for like 20 plus years, but I've lost track of it the last several years.
I don't know.
I'm sorry, no, or you don't know?
I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm putting in the chat box the 3 questions we ask at the end, and I'm sure Patrick will be very interested in our responses to his presentation today. And just a couple of presentation points. You managed to get a lot into a small space. You might consider next time, Christy, you had a very good question before white folks arrived, what did people eat? And I'm wondering whether the background about Basa could have come first, just as here's who we are, here's what we're doing, and so forth. And now, here for today, then do your attention step then, and then even amplify a bit. So, well, what would we do if we wanted to eat from the land? So that's the need step. And then you can provide the wholeness step, which sort of came all through, which is there's enough food on this, on this land to feed us a lot more than we realize. And we'd like to give you a picture into that. And then describe maybe the 2 or 3 things you're going to do. So just to add those little framings that might lift up just to that next level of, oh my gosh. Because what you've got is a great topic and a great presence with it.
They did an amazing job, but they could have flipped the order maybe, because that way Bridget giving the background on the plants and then what can you do with them, that might have sequenced it, because all the information was amazing, but that might have cognitively like allowed a follow through.
Yeah,
I know. I struggled with that first slide because I was starting with a BASA presentation and then going into native food. So yeah, you have to somehow link it, right? Yeah, it's just tricky.
Yeah, and the more we do, the more fun we have with these little things, the polishings. But we are grateful. This is a fun example. I think a lot of us are going to try eating some mesquite pods. And I'm going to put the piece into the chat now. And when you're done, let's consider ourselves adjourned. It is now 12.